a lot of people really do make choices that lead them to be pretty close to the edge. And I'm not comfortable with that. I think that with economic margin comes freedom. And that is extremely important for me because I don't want to be beholden to anybody. I don't want to, be desperate at any point because, oh God, it has to work out. You lose all ability to innovate when you have, oh God, it has to work out, because innovation is never definitionally guaranteed to work out.
Welcome to the Impact Multiplier CEO podcast. I'm Richard Metcalf, founder of X Quadrant, and my mission is to help the world's top CEOs and entrepreneurs shift from incremental to exponential progress and create a huge positive impact on our world. Now, that requires you to reinvent yourself and transform your business. So, if you're ready to play a bigger game than ever before, I invite you to join us and become an Impact Multiplier CEO. How can you play the long game for your leadership? What does it look like to create exponential success by taking a really strategic view, not just on the current time frame, but looking perhaps years into the future? Today, I'm speaking with Dorie Clark, who's an expert on this. She's written books about it, but most importantly, she's lived it. You see, many years ago, Dorie was a consultant, a speaker, and a coach, doing pretty well, but not really making the mark that she wanted to make. She made some strategic moves. She actually gave up 1/3 of her business to invest it in strategic activity. And it was that catapulted her to pretty much the pinnacle of the business thought leadership space. Her books have been WSJ Bestsellers. She's been nominated to the Thinkers 50 list of top management thinkers 3 times. She's a contributor to Forbes, to Harvard Business Review, to lots of different influential places. So she's somebody who's really catapulted herself and gone on this exponential journey of impact that we talk about. And in her book, The Long Game, which we discuss, she kind of goes through some of the key principles of thinking that help us to take that trajectory. For Dorie, it's not over. She's been playing a second long game, actually creating a Broadway musical that her intention is to get onto the stage in the next couple of years. This has been a 10-year project for her. So Dorie is somebody who lives this stuff, and she speaks on it and she writes very eloquently on it. So enjoy this conversation with Dorie Clark. Hi, Dorie, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Richard. So good to be here.
So I'm going to start. So this is going to be a really fun conversation. You're somebody I've followed. I've read a lot of your books over the years. Your current book, The Long Game, is all about thinking strategically, which, anyone who knows me knows that's really close to my own heart. It's the subject of my own book in some ways. And so I think enjoy this conversation to actually explore how we kind of look at the long game and how we optimize for our ultimate impact over time. So this is going to be a fun one. I'm going to start with, I've kind of already warmed you up to this question possibly, but I still want you to tell the audience, why don't you like red peppers? Let's just start there where it's important.
I mean, mission critical here. Absolutely. Yes. I assume most of your audience has tried red peppers. If they haven't, I just want to tell you they're awful. They're terrible. So I think they are bitter, and I don't really understand why other people like them. So I don't want to judge other people's choices. I'm kind of a libertarian in the pepper department, but if I were advising people, I would say don't do it.
There we go. So, you heard it here. This is controversy on the Impact Multiplier CEO podcast. We're really getting into it here. You thought the Brussels sprouts wars were bad enough, but we're getting into the red pepper wars. Okay. So luckily if my son was here, I'd bring him on. He's a big fan of red peppers. So you two could have kind of slugged it out, the heavy hitters in this philosophical debate.
Well, I'll come back. We'll have the cage match next time.
There we go. That'd be a fun one. Okay, so yeah, again, let's slow it down. The Long Game, right? It's a book you've written, you've spoken about a lot of times. I've heard you speak on it. It's really fascinating. How to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world. And what I want to focus on perhaps today is let's talk about your own journey, because you're somebody who, I don't know how many followers you have on social media. It's huge. You're a top voice here and there. You're on this publication and that publication. You're in the Thinkers 50 list. You're somebody who has really cut her own niche in the world of business thought leadership. and you've still got other projects and so forth. And I know beyond the world of business thought leadership as well, right? I know you're writing Broadway productions as well in your spare time, or even in your non-spare time. So take us back, like, what was the thinking at the start of that process? Like, did you consciously decide I want to like go big, go wide? Was it a happy accident? Was it a master plan? You take us back a few years where you were not a known entity. And what were the key
Absolutely.
decisions that you made?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, I think, like a lot of people, certainly probably the majority of my choices were a little bit happenstance, and then maybe they worked out in the rear view mirror. Certainly, one example of that is areas that I focused on. Sort of what are you known for? What's your core IP? This is something that some people from the beginning really have a very clear idea of, here's what I want to say. I was a bit more of a generalist, and there were a lot of things I could talk about. There were a lot of things I was interested in talking about, but I had absolutely no idea what I should focus on, or even if I should focus. I mean, I guess intellectually I had the idea like, okay, yes, focusing is good. People can understand better what you do. But I was extremely reluctant to do it. And so that for me was much more of an emergent property where I just put a lot of content out into the world and eventually was able to discern where there seemed to be resonance, where people liked what I was saying. There seemed to be more traction. And so at least at that point, I was smart enough to say, okay, well, good, I'll do more of the thing that people like. But so that's sort of an example of me following the evidence, but not necessarily setting out a strategic path. But there was a really critical decision that I made about a decade ago that was a strategic bet that I am proud of. And I feel like it's kind of a useful example because ultimately, one of the bedrocks of my philosophy is that when it comes to strategy, the crucial piece is actually the willingness, the emotional willingness to make a choice and to deal with the consequences of that, because there often are negative consequences that come from cutting off options. And so in this particular case, I had built a good business. I had, we're talking around, maybe 2010, 2011. I had built a good, 6-figure consulting business, and I was happy at what I was doing, but I also realized that I was kind of at a plateau. I had been at an income plateau for several years. And frankly, I'd been at kind of an impact plateau because I was getting referrals. I was getting enough business, but I was working with relatively small clients. And that made sense because I had started my business when I was in my 20s. I didn't have a lot of high level connections. I had come out of working in politics and journalism. And so there wasn't an easy path into lucrative corporate consulting contracts. I just didn't know those people. And so I realized that if I wanted to demonstrably move the needle on my business moving forward, I needed to meet different people, quite literally. And I didn't have a good pathway for it. So I made the strategic call that I would cut off probably the bottom third of my business, which meant that there would be a real reduction in my income. And I would reallocate the time to content creation, specifically to blogging and to writing for high profile publications. And in doing that, I said, all right, this is my bet. I am going to raise my profile. I am going to get better known. I'm going to get my ideas out there. And that will lead higher profile people and organizations to me. That's how I can grow my business. Right. And I did that for several years, and eventually it did pay off. But it took about 3 years for the hit to my income to be restored. And the good news is it was a good bet. I now, have a much more robust business than I ever did beforehand. But yeah, you have to make a call sometimes, which can be uncomfortable.
What was it like when you were in that trough, when you were like, I'm churning out these articles, nobody's yet responding, I'm not getting the audience that perhaps I wanted to? Was there a real sense in which, am I doing the right thing? Or were you already seeing, well, at least my audience is growing quite quickly, and you felt confident?
I think there's two things at play that could potentially be useful for everybody. The first is where it really gets precarious is if you are making a bet that is, I'll call it a dangerous bet. So meaning you say, oh, I'm going to cut off a third of my income, but you really need that income for your bills and things like that. I had deliberately made some upstream choices. I had bought a condo and things like that, but I didn't buy the fanciest condo. Now I have some nice places, but when I first bought, I did it in this like emerging neighborhood that like literally, quite literally, it was across the street from a heroin dealer. And so it was a very nice apartment, but yeah, there were like drug busts and stuff. And so I had margin. I made choices so that I would never be desperate for money, because we all make poor choices if you're in a situation of desperation. So you have to have some margin to enable you to make the strategic choice.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of a business principle that we'd use often, especially back in the day in strategy consulting, but I still apply it in our lives. It's the same thing. It's just like you've got financial risk and operational risk, right? So if you've got a lot of debt, high financial risk, then actually you need to keep your operational risk pretty low, because you've got to pay the bank each month. Whereas if actually you've got low financial risk, as you said, you've got plenty of margin, then actually you can take more operational risks. You can have more volatility on the income side.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a super helpful framework. So I think that's one principle that was in play there. The other one was, I'm a big fan in general of ensuring that you can find wins along the way, because the ultimate payoff, and this is one of the key challenges that I talk about in my book, The Long Game. If you're setting a fairly substantial, meaningful goal, it may well be multiple years, I mean, sometimes even decades before it comes to fruition. And try as you might, there's often very, very few things you can do to speed that up. You just have to deal with it. It's going to take a long time. And so in order to keep yourself motivated and feeling okay about that process in the interim, you need to identify the wins that you can celebrate. And so in my case, the good news was, even though the ultimate metric that I wanted, which was, unsolicited inbound inquiries, like sort of high level opportunities coming to me, that takes a while. That's not going to come with your first article or something like that. But in the interim, I was spending a lot of time doing interviews. At the time I wrote for Forbes, and I would interview authors in the space who had come out with books or things like that. And for me, that was very exciting, because it was an opportunity to connect with new colleagues and expand my network. And so I figured, you know what, whether or not this actually yields a piece of business, it's certainly going to be a good thing for me in whatever way to have a better network in my field. And so it's at least achieving that goal. And that was helpful along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that building relationships, it's really building assets, right? I mean, I don't want to make relationships into transactions, right? They're much more than transactions, right? But every relationship is an asset. Every article you put out in the web, it's that idea of, for me, strategy is often about investing in future success, right? It's building assets that are going to pay off.
Yes.
Rather than when we use our time and we're just doing something that's here today and gone tomorrow. Like, you work with a client, you do it, you get the check or whatever, and you move on. Like, you might not have anything to show for that above the money. Whereas you build a relationship, you create some intellectual property. These are the things, I guess, that have stacked up for you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right on.
Okay, so I think great distinction, first of all, you've got this emergent property. It's like, yeah, sometimes we like to say there's a 5-step game plan from the start. The reality is normally we are responding to what comes our way, right? And what opportunities we've managed to create, and we navigate that path. So you definitely started off like that. You did make this choice, which is quite bold, right? To take a third of your clients and to say, I'm repurposing that into an investment. Do you think that the specific investment, if you were doing it now, like you talked about blogging, obviously there was a period where blogging was perhaps in a different place than it is now. Do you feel that there was like a coalition, a convergence of events that made that was the right time and the right place to be doing that kind of content creation? Or do you think you would still do the same now if you were starting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to a certain extent, I would do something similar. I mean, the particulars would probably change. Part of it for me was, and I think this is a useful question for everyone, is sort of what is your unique competitive advantage? And in my case, I had worked previously as a journalist. And so writing was something that I actually felt like I could do faster and easier than other people because of the training that I had had. And so I thought, okay, well, that's useful. So writing would probably be it. Different places have different advantages. At the time, Forbes was just getting started with their contributor network. And so it was a much less crowded space. And so it was much easier to get very high page views and exposure. So I think it was probably a better opportunity then than it is now, where there's, thousands of contributors and they have this, they've subsequently introduced the kind of pay to play, quote unquote councils, the coaches council, and then this and that, which just clogs the pipeline. So I probably wouldn't literally do that, but some form of writing I probably would, because, there's a lot of ways to do it. I don't think that writing is the only one. I deliberately use very agnostic terms. I created something that I call the recognized expert formula, which I teach in a program that I run. And the basic idea, for people who are thoughtful professionals that are looking to get recognized for their expertise, there's three key components. There is your network, of course. There's social proof, meaning, what is your sort of easily perceived external metrics of credibility. And then there's content creation. And I'm very specific. It's content. It's not necessarily writing or what have you. It just means that you need to find a vehicle to publicly share your ideas, because you can't be recognized for your expertise if people don't know what your ideas are. But, whether you're better at speaking and so you give talks, or you have a podcast or something like that, that's great. If you're a video kind of person, awesome. There's a lot of ways that you can do it, but writing is still certainly a viable option among the universe of options.
Perfect. So let's zoom forward a few years. So obviously now, you have somebody who's written a whole bunch of very successful books, you're a sought after speaker and everything else. What's the long game you're now playing at this point?
Yeah. So for me, I'll give you one example. I think for all of us, we have different areas of long game, whether it's our personal life or our professional life, or sometimes avocationally. In my case, one example or one case study that I actually talk about in my book, The Long Game, is I started in 2016 writing musical theater. I had never done it before. And I decided that I would create a 10-year goal for myself, sort of the epitome of a long range strategic thinking. I was going to create a 10-year goal where my ambition was to write a show that made it to Broadway. And it's an ambitious goal, but the truth is you can actually do a lot in 10 years, much more than people imagine. And so as we're recording this, I am now on year 8 of this. It's not entirely clear to me whether I will have a show on Broadway in 2 years. That would be amazing. But I can tell you that the act of pursuing that, I literally started out from a place of not knowing at all how to write musical theater. I have now learned how to do it. I've completed a fairly prestigious training program for it. I've written 2 complete musicals, and I'm working on a third. And one of my shows has had both this, an Actors Equity staged reading in New York, and is actually having its first university level production in a couple of months. So it's moving forward and advancing into a very real thing that came out of a place where I had no experience whatsoever. So a lot is possible in 10 years.
What was the driver for that particular project?
So in early 2016, I'll actually go back even a little bit further. In 2015, I went a little bit nuts with work and with travel for work. I released a book that year. That one was called Stand Out. And I did 74 talks that year. So I was giving, basically a talk and a half per week, many of them travel based. So I was just constantly gone, constantly on the move. And also constantly sick. And at a certain point, toward the end of the year, I was just like, oh, this is so ridiculous. I'm traveling all the time. I feel miserable. I'm putatively living in New York City, but I'm actually, traveling all the time. And so I decided that I would embark upon a campaign of what I called one uniquely New York activity per week. And so I demanded that of myself that I would start to basically appreciate the city more that I was living in by making specific choices. So like watching a movie on Netflix does not count. You can do that anywhere. But going to a Broadway show, for instance, would be a uniquely New York activity. So I made an effort to start to go to some more shows. And I went to one with a friend, Fun Home, which was a Tony winner that year. And it was just so great and powerful and impactful. I literally just woke up the next morning and I was like, I need to do that. I need to learn how to write musicals.
Okay.
And so I've just kind of taken the ball and run with it ever since.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So have you found that, so again, that's something which presumably has taken time from you, right? That could have been on more close range, revenue earning, work, so forth, right? It takes a long time to master this art, I assume. So again, did you have any inner kind of qualms? Like, am I gonna, am I taking away from my core business, my growth there? Or did you feel, I'm just kind of curious about the inner decisions, because probably many people have gone, oh, well, that'd be cool to do that, but you've actually gone and done it. So I'm just wondering, were there any barriers that you felt you had to overcome internally in order to actually make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question. I've actually been okay with it in the sense that, again, one of the themes that I talk about in the long game is something that has kind of gotten neglected by its original advocates, which is the 20% time concept that Google, very famously propounded in its earliest days, of spending up to 20% of your time on these kind of speculative long range activities. Most Googlers these days are not doing that anymore. They've kind of succumbed, like everybody else, to just being busy and doing the thing that's in front of them. But I do think it's an incredibly valuable thing to do, because we know the world is changing fast. We don't know in what direction. We can have theories, but in the end, who knows? And so having something outside of our core activities that we are spending time on can be very powerful. I mean, sometimes it's, maybe more directly income generating, but at a minimum, it's about, giving you new knowledge, new experiences, new connections, new perspectives that you wouldn't have. And so I don't really ever feel bad about allocating 20% of my time to long-term strategic bets like that. Also, again, I do think that financial necessity is an important consideration. And so it has always been an important value for me to have a lot of liquid cash and to keep expenses as low as possible. I mean, you don't want to sacrifice to the point that you're not enjoying your life. But I think that there are a lot of people that I look at them and I see the house, or I see the car, or I see the vacations, and I think, wow, I wouldn't do that. And I actually am pretty sure I make a lot more money than you. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a different choice and it's cool. Everybody's doing their thing. But a lot of people really do make choices that lead them to be pretty close to the edge. And I'm not comfortable with that. I think that with economic margin comes freedom. And that is extremely important for me, because I don't want to be beholden to anybody. I don't want to, be desperate at any point because, oh God, it has to work out. You lose all ability to innovate when you have, oh God, it has to work out, because innovation is never definitionally guaranteed to work out.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation. This is just a quick interlude to introduce you to two transformative programs that we run. The first is Rivendell, my exclusive group of top CEOs who are committed to transforming themselves, their businesses, and the world. It's an incredible peer group and a deep coaching experience that will push you to new heights, no matter how successful you've already been. The second is Impact Accelerator, a coaching program for executives who are ready to make a big leap forward in their own leadership. It's regularly described as life-changing, and no other program provides such personal, strategic clarity, a measurable shift in stakeholder perceptions, and a world-class leadership development environment. Find out about both of these programs at xquadrant.com/services. Now back to the conversation. Yes. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it's perfectly put. Speaking for myself, for me, impact and contribution is a key value, but underpinning it, which are like essential components for me, are creativity and and fun, in fact. Like,
Yes.
So because I know that like if it's contribution, but I was just grinding it out, I'm not going to be able to sustain that. So actually, to have something that's sustainable for me, it has to have that fun and creativity, which, as you said, requires some margin, right? Because creative projects, you don't quite know, are they going to work out, right? Whereas you say if you have to, and I've got people who are very successful compatriots of mine, in communities that I'm part of, who have very successful coaching businesses, but they're like booked out from 9 till 6 or whatever with X coaching calls, with X hours between them. And I've always divided my business so that I have margin to create. And it's a different choice, right? And I suspect as well that the lifestyle is so important. I once worked with a client. He wasn't actually a client. He was like somebody who's in my network. I coached him a few times. I think he had like a 9-figure personal worth. I mean, in the hundreds of millions. And he said to me, I always remember it. He said, Richard, the next 5 years are going to be turgid. It's such a word, like, it's going to be so awful and like just so dull. And then he started to backpedal. I can't complain, golden handcuffs. And I was like, well, what, why? You've got this amazing business. I said, I can't do this. I can't do that. If I let somebody else do it, who knows? And it was a prison of his own making. It really was.
Absolutely. Wow. That's powerful. So Richard, tell me more about your long game. How are you thinking about, this is your world too, man. How are you thinking about playing the long game in your own life?
Yeah. Well, I think so. My overall mission, and as anybody who's listened to the podcast, multiple times will probably know or read my stuff, is I'm definitely on a mission to help the world's top business leaders be forces for good at an unprecedented scale. That's what I love. It's the game I love to play. And so that is, if you like, my long game. And the reason and how that's impacted me, for example, is I'd say I'm a recovering high achiever. So there was a time when like every quarter I was like, well, if my business is not exponentially growing every single quarter, then am I a fraud? And who am I to possibly advise anybody on anything, right? But I realized actually that is not my game. Obviously I want my business to grow and it's growing, but actually my long game is, am I moving forward on making the biggest impact I have and the thing that really lights me up and is exciting? And so that kind of place of how can I be the person today that is actually already the number one go-to advisor for really successful business leaders who want to be forces for good, because it's a now and a not yet. Yeah. So, am I absolutely the number one coaching the most senior? No, right? And I can also point to clients who are, these are some of the world's top leaders. They're running extraordinary businesses, or they're extraordinary, they're in the top 1% or 1% of the 1% or whatever, right? They're already there. So it's important not to forget what's already been achieved.
Yes.
But also to start to think, at least in my sense, it's like, well, what would that person be doing? Right? If I'm being that person today, how would I show up in this conversation? Tomorrow morning when I get out of bed, what would that person be doing? Would they be fiddling on their website? Would they, who would they be calling up? How would they be showing up in conversations? And so I suppose that's kind of my overall mission. And then I think the other part, and perhaps this is a way of bringing it back to you as well, is I've been thinking recently on that way of how to maintain creativity and fun and innovation on that journey and experiment, because there's all sorts of things to try. And what's come to my mind is that, you can see me, I've got my Freddie Mercury poster behind me. So I love rock music. I'm a guitarist. And I'm thinking, if I was a rock band, right, what would I do? Because I believe in reinvention. All the best pop stars reinvent themselves.
Yes.
And so they would release an album, they would tour that album, they would release another album, they would tour that album, they would reinvent themselves and have another star and release another album. They've always got the other stuff in their back catalogue. They can always bring it out in the concert and play the greatest hits, but they can also play the new stuff.
Yes. Did you see the Bee Gees documentary?
I've not seen that one yet. I've been going through, there's so many documentaries right now, especially on Netflix, about all these pop stars and, We've been going through them dutifully, but we haven't got to that one yet.
Yeah, the new Bee Gees one is actually really excellent, and part of the reason I liked it is it's got a good strategic lesson embedded in it, because the Bee Gees, first of all, they reinvented themselves. I didn't even realize this, that pre-disco they were actually already popular. Maybe you knew this. They, like, in the 60s they were kind of like a rock band. Okay. And it was like, oh, okay, I didn't even know that. But then they got stratospheric in the 70s when they went into disco. And then as soon as there was the disco backlash, they became pariahs and nobody wanted anything to do with the Bee Gees. They were not successful. They couldn't sell albums. They couldn't get arrested practically. And so for about a decade, they pivoted to songwriting, and they were masterful songwriters, and they ended up, and I didn't realize this either, writing songs for almost all of the most popular artists of the 80s, just in the background, because they're like, what, this is not our time. This is not when the world wants to see our faces. Okay, fine. Here, Barbara Streisand, here, other famous people, you sing our songs. And they did a great job and made a ton of money doing it.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. So that's what I've been thinking about, and I've seen it in my business as well. The time when I was like the strategy guy, and I've really moved much more into more transformational work. I do strategic, but I'm also had to be more magnetic, and things evolve. And so I'm thinking, what's my next book going to be, and how my next album or whatever. So
yeah,
with that metaphor, I'm wondering about you, because you've, as you've said, you've done a whole range of things, right? From Stand Out, all the way through to the current one, and each one has had quite a different theme. So do you see, how do you move from one to the other?
Yeah, from my books, I do feel like there's been a little bit of an arc, I guess you could say. I mean, you can certainly read the books separately, grab the ones that feel most of interest, and they're complete and freestanding. But broadly speaking, I mean, Reinventing You, I'll do the show and tell.
One, right?
Reinventing You is the first one, and it's basically about how do you position yourself. How do you reinvent yourself into the place that you want to be, the company you want to be, the field you want to be? How do you position yourself so that you are where you want in the professional ecosystem? Stand Out is then answering the next question, which is, okay, you're there. How do you get recognized? How do you become known as one of the best at whatever it is that you are doing?
Yeah.
The third book that I wrote is called Entrepreneurial You, and it kind of answered the next, what I think of at least is the next logical question, which is, okay, you've gotten lots of positive recognition that don't pay the bills. How do you get wealthy doing it? What are the strategies that you can use on both the front end and the back end to be able to monetize your expertise? And then finally, we have the long game, which is thinking to a certain extent, you could say about legacy, but it's about, what's it for? What's the thrust? What do you want your life to look like overall?
Yeah, nice. So I want to know what's the other one. Is it like after you're dead? The next one is like, beyond the grave, right?
It's called Reincarnating You, Richard. It's going to be very, very big seller.
There we go, yeah. So again, was that by design, or was it more that it evolved your own journey as you were going through those stages?
It was really just answering the questions that were on my mind. So they always say, right, write the books that you would want to read. And so I tried to really live that out. I also, very deliberately, as part of strategy, thought of these books as essentially a really good way that I could interview smart people that I wanted to talk to and ask them exceptionally nosy questions. So especially, for writing Entrepreneurial You, for instance, if you're writing a book about how to make money, then it becomes not rude to be like, so how much did you earn from that? And, what exactly was the structure there? And that was very helpful. I'm a big fan of transparency. And so being able to learn information for myself and then share that with other people, I think was quite valuable. I want to democratize information as much as we can.
So based on all of that and this whole arc, of everything you've looked at, let's think about people who might be listening in right now, which, let's say, they're already a very senior business leader. They might own a company, might be CEO, they might be in the C-suite. So they've already had a lot of success, in Eastern traditional terms. They might be probably pretty overloaded and they've got a lot on their plate because of a lot of responsibilities. What are the questions that you think they might need to be asking themselves for them to get to the next level? Like what comes to your mind as to, or where might be their blind spots be?
Yes. Well, I think that you're touching on something important, which is what I realized in researching the long game was, kind of for me, in some ways, the most interesting thing about strategy is that unlike almost everything else in business, pretty much everyone agrees that strategic thinking is a good thing. There's not like a lot of debate about that. But the problem is that so many people pay lip service and they say, oh, yes, it's a wonderful thing. And then they don't do it. Yeah. And I wanted to understand, what's getting in our way here, right? I mean, you are too, right? Making time for strategy. Yeah. And by time, we mean sometimes literally making time for it, but also as of course, it's, emotional space, all the barriers, all the things that get in our way with regard to it. And so to a certain extent, though, the first step really is logistical. It's just clearing out the calendar, clearing out the dross and the dreck that is impeding us. And so I think that sometimes it's, really diving in and asking questions about, and it depends what verticals we want to be looking at, but it could be anything from what is the single biggest driver of our revenues? I mean, just really simple questions like that, but that often get buried or overlooked somehow. I mean, we often tend to disproportionately pay a lot of time and attention to the problem areas instead of focusing on like, okay, well, what's going well and how can we do more of that?
Right.
There's kind of some basic questions there, but also it's kind of higher level questions about ourselves, right? I mean, a really good question to ask, over time is what kind of person do I want to be? And what does that look like? Because if we are clear about the values or if we're clear about what we want our lives to look like, then it becomes a lot easier to reverse engineer that. And oftentimes the correct next action almost answers itself.
Yeah. It's a great thing. I think every time I speak with my own coach, obviously I live my, I practice what I preach, and pretty much like everything always comes back to who you're being in this situation, right? It's a brilliant filter, and we often have choices as well. I find between what's the sensible thing to do and then what's the brave thing to do, and actually the brave thing to do is normally actually the thing you need to do.
Yes, amen.
Well, this is really fascinating, Dorie. I think perhaps to wrap up this conversation, what does multiplying your impact look like for you? So as you look forward, what would that look like for you to have over the next few years to go, wow, I can't believe I was here in 2024 and now, whoa, I can't believe where I've moved to next and the impact I've had.
Yeah, well, one of the things, Richard, that I think we probably have in common is I'm also very interested in finding ways to help others surface and share their best ideas. I mean, thinking back to when I started my business, which was now 18 years ago, it was so hard and so frustrating. I felt like I kept having to like reinvent the wheel because getting your message heard in this noisy world was very challenging. And even if you're good, even if you're good, even if like maybe the tiny circle of people around you know you're good, it's very hard to expand beyond that. And so I spent a lot of time studying and reverse engineering. And this is, a lot of what drives my books, really reverse engineering this question of, all right, well, how do you get your ideas noticed and heard? How do you become a recognized expert? And so subsequently, a lot of my attention, 8 years ago, I started an online course in community called Recognized Expert. And it's really been very satisfying for me because the goal of that is just to help other people figure out how to get out there, how to take all their ideas and their knowledge and help other people with it. And so, I mean, just as a couple of like fun facts, I mean, I haven't even tallied it in about a year, but as of last year, 68 people in the Recognized Expert community had gone on to become Harvard Business Review contributors. Like, I love that. I mean, that's a marvelous metric of people really finding a way to, at scale, impact other people. Just in the last couple of months, I mean, we were talking earlier about meeting at Thinkers 50. So they just announced the crop of this year's Thinkers 50 radar thinkers, which are the people that are sort of on the watch list of like, these people are like rising stars. There are 30 people per year that they identify. And this year, 5 of them were members of the recognized expert community. And so it's very cool for me to see a lot of people that, hopefully in some way I've been able to help encourage, who are making a dent in terms of having their ideas do some good in the world.
Yeah, beautiful. And so as you continue to do that and scale your impact, like what's one reinvention that might await you? Like how might you need to shift who you're being to kind of go to your next level?
Yeah, well, I think as you were pointing to, there's kind of the large and small ways to answer that. I mean, broadly speaking, of course, I am as I'm coming up on this 10 years, I am intending to make a push and to try to get my show or shows that I have written seen by as many people as possible, hopefully finding a way to the Broadway stage or some equivalent thereof. So I'm going to continue to work on that and allocate time toward that. Additionally, I would say for all of us, an important thing to do is just, regularly to make these sort of audits of how we're spending our time, what we're doing. I mean, I'm a big fan of creating constraints. And so when I think about having more time to focus on high impact things, again, we can't do it if our days are chock-a-block with meetings. And so back in 2020, I started blocking off Fridays and not having meetings on Fridays. And now I've done the same thing for Mondays as well. So the middle of the week is a little bit busier. We're of course speaking in the middle of the week, but having a couple of days where you have more freedom and flexibility to either be doing deep work activities or having networking meetings or things like that. That's some of the really high value stuff that often gets lost in the hurly-burly of business life.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Well, Dorie, hey, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. It's been a lot of fun. You've got some great points from insights from the Bee Gees, the Broadway, Red Peppers, but we've been talking about as well, like the crucial part of strategy, making a choice and the balance between the moves that you make and the kind of randomness and the emergence of the journey. And then I think it's, great points around finding your unique advantage, right, in this. And perhaps creating 20% time, or if it's not 20% to start with, like at least something, 2% time to start with, to actually start to explore little seedlings that might have a big payoff in the future.
Amen to that, Richard. I think that's wonderful. This has been such a great conversation. I'll just mention for folks who want to go even deeper, I have a free resource, the Long Game Strategic Thinking Self-Assessment, and folks can download that for free at dorieclark.com/thelonggame. And Richard, thanks so much for having me on. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Dorie. I'll put all that into the show notes as well so people can click directly through to that assessment, which is a good one. So thanks so much and speak soon.
Thanks.
Well, that's a wrap. If you received value from this conversation, please do leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. We'd deeply appreciate it. And if you'd like to check out the show notes from this episode, head to xquadrant.com/podcast, where you'll find all the details. Now, finally, when you're in top leadership, who supports and challenges you at a deep level to help you multiply your impact? Discover more about the different ways we can support you at xquadrant.com.